Hi all, we're going to have a look now at Yusupov versus Kasparov in round 5 of the Linares 1990 tournament. So Yusupov playing white, kicked off with knight f3, and Kasparov went into his king's Indian with g6 here, and white played g3 as well, so both sides are fianchettoing their bishops. And now we see a Kasparov plan of knight d7 followed by e5. So that's a very logical way of playing against the Fianchetto variation. Simply trying to establish a pawn on e5, puts pressure on the dark squares in white's position. So after castles, Kasparov played knight d7, and after knight c3, e5. Now if white plays d5 here, then the c5 square could be useful for black. So white was careful not to play d5, he played instead h3, and now Kasparov played c6. So this c6 lets the queen potentially come to either b6 or a5. From b6 it can put pressure on the d4 square, and this is what occurred in the game. After e4, queen b6, Kasparov is tempting white to also consider c5 to double white's pawns because of d takes, as we're going to see now. So c5 was actually played, and after d takes c, d takes e5, we have an interesting pawn structure. Both sides have these doubled pawns. So who is worse here? Or are the weaknesses compensated by each other? After knight e8, we see a plan unravelling of knight c7 to e6, which gives black quite a solid position. It seems that black has a potential weakness on the d6 square though, but if this is not exploitable, say white had doubled rooks here and got one of them to d6, if the rooks can't really do anything from d6 to cause damage horizontally, then Nimzovich would, I think, not consider that such a bad problem, or later writers such as Bronstein. He's talked at length about the d6 weakness in the King's Indian, and I think this is an example game where that d6 weakness is academic. Knight a4 was played anyway here, attacking the black queen and maybe pressurising c5. Kasparov was not worried to put his queen on a6. Potentially white has an idea of rook e1 and bishop f1, but this isn't really going to do anything because black has now b5 to fend off for any threats like that. White actually played bishop f4, and now Kasparov continues this plan of knight c7 to e6. So knight c7 comes. White now moves the queen to c2, so the rook's prepared to perhaps go to d6 and be doubled there. So we have rook fd1, now rook e8. Now rook d6. So unless this is a really exploitable weakness, it's not so bad. Kasparov pursues now a plan of expanding his queenside space and generates quite a bit of counterplay. He plays first queen a5 to support the c5 pawn, but also potentially queen b4. Now white plays rook ad1. And now knight b6 was played. So actually knight b6 is only possible because the queen is supporting that c5 pawn. Because otherwise white would have two pieces and there's only one protector from the knight here. So queen a5 was preparing the knight b6, quite logically. Now white didn't want to retreat the knight to c3, which is quite interesting. Instead, white allowed black to double the pawns again, but this pawn mass is quite ominous. It's quite a solid pawn mass of two sets of double pawns, and also black has this A file pressure, and A2 is an immediate target. So we see now that Kasparov's pressing on the queen side. After A3 he plays queen A4, and after queen E2 now B5, so these pawns are coming forward. The immediate threat is the crunching B4, so where white's pawn structure is really under fire. Again, these rooks are not really doing anything on this D file. So this d6 is kind of a not a very useful weakness to do anything with. And maybe that situation isn't helped with white's double pawns as well. So queen e3 was played now. White is trying to exchange off the dark squared bishops, perhaps to get an attack. But it never really seemed to work out. Kasparov simply played b4 now. And after queen takes b4, black's now threatening rook a2 as well as queen takes b2. So the b2 pawn is really under fire, isolated And black's pawns here are looking quite ominous already. White hasn't really got a counter sort of pawns coming down on the other side at the moment, because these two pieces are blocking this F pawn. So in terms of pawn structure mobility, black seems to have all the pawn mobility here, with these pawns potentially like space invaders coming down the board. We're going to see that later on now. After rook 6 to d2, rook a2, white's becoming very passive now. Rook b1, c4, so the pawns start marching forward. Rook c2, now b5. So black's pawns have moved quite significantly and white's stayed the same now. After bishop h6, Kasparov now counters in the centre with queen c5, pressurising that e5 pawn. After queen c1, now knight d4. So really challenging these dark squares and increasing the pressure. So white now exchanged off the dark squared bishop, played knight takes d4, and now played b3. So countering the pressure on e5, trying to blast the c line open. Kasparov actually now just played rook takes c2, and after queen takes c2, c3. So these pawns still march forward. And now white played rook d1. Kasparov played queen c5. What would happen if queen takes e5 here? Let's have a look at that as a new variation. Rybka thinks here b4, so that would be at least temporarily blocking the further advance of these pawns. And white now also has rook d3 coming up. So black has to be careful about these pawns being stopped and munched up. So after rook d1, Kasparov played queen c5, so he's keeping an eye on white not playing b4 here with this move. White played it anyway, b4, and Kasparov took it. And now rook d3 to at least get this c3 pawn. Kasparov was not fazed by this. He carried on the march of pawns, just sacking that c3 pawn. So we see now, again, that Kasparov pawns are still looking very dangerous on the queen side. At least white has the chance now to play f4. So maybe now that there's threats later of f5. So these pawns are finally a little bit mobile. Kasparov checks, and after king h2 plays queen d4. So the price that's being played, that black's pieces are very good now. There's no double pawns to concern about, which could be a weakness in the endgame. And the pieces are generally more aggressive than white's. Yusupov played rook f3, and after b4, these passed pawns are very, very dangerous. In fact, so dangerous that after queen a4, which seemingly double attacks b4 and e8, Kasparov played an absolutely brilliant move, which was completely underestimated by Rybka. c3. And it's a phenomenal idea here that if queen takes e8, Kasparov would simply play queen d7, winning in all variations. Because queen takes d7, bishop takes d7, and the pawns cannot be stopped in this position. For example, rook f1, c2, and now the threat is b3, b2, and queening. And if white tried to get, say, a bishop to e4, it would still be hopeless. So if the tactical e6 was played, with the idea of e5 to get a bishop to munch these pawns, then simply black continues b3, and if bishop e4, just bishop f5. So it's all completely winning here. Bishop takes c2, bishop takes c2, and now b2 is an ominous threat. So that was a very important side variation. Let's look at what actually played. Rook takes c3 was actually played. Kasparov just continued with bishop d7 now with a clear advantage. And white now desperately just played rook c4. But this passed b pawn now is exceptionally dangerous. So we see now the b pawn being used to gain a decisive advantage. So Kasparov now a piece up. And the rest of the game was technique really, a mopping up job with the extra bishop. So let's quickly see what happened. So white was boxed into a corner with his king awkwardly placed. And Kasparov just slowly used his king to bring it up the board and force white into a virtual zugzwang with this final move rook g3. And here Yusupov resigned.